Welcome everybody to this session on humanizing the WTO, seeking a sustainable, just, and also integrative trade agenda. My name is Joachim Monkelbaan and I'm the representative for sustainable and just economic systems at the Quaker United Nations office here in Geneva. So this session is in the form of a workshop. So after my opening remarks and the remarks from our panelists here, we would like to open up the floor for a brainstorm session. Speaking of our panelists, we are very grateful and lucky to have with us today Yvonne Bartman, to my right here. And she's the Senior Program Officer on Trade and Development, Employment and Social Policy at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung here in Geneva. To my left, I have Rajesh Agarwal, who is the Chief of Trade Facilitation and Trade Policy at the International Trade Center. So to say a few words about the title and also the purpose of the meeting today. The title opens with Humanizing the WTO. And this is a term that really builds on what Director General Dr. Ngozi says often, and what was also a main message from her plenary opening speech for the public forum yesterday. And that is, trade is about people. So the question is, what are the benefits from trade and from the WTO for people? What are the benefits from the WTO for human well-being, for example, which is such an important question amidst a pandemic? Because eventually national governments are responsible for their citizens' well-being, how can the WTO support those efforts in a bottom-up fashion as a member-driven organization? Then, in terms of sustainability, trade has an important role to play when it comes to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are several exciting initiatives on trade environment and environmental sustainability going towards the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO in December. Those initiatives include initiatives on plastics, on fossil fuel subsidy reform, and also a new platform called the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions. In terms of the justice aspects, which is a word that's also in the title, the question is how the WTO and trade can be more supportive of vulnerable and marginalized groups and also supportive of human rights protections. For example, when I was at the European Commission a few years ago and we received pens there, those pens, they said trade for growth. And when I came back just a few months ago, those pens had changed and they said trade for all. So that's a shift going on there. And then there's also the word integrative in the title of this session. And the question here is, how can the WTO complement ongoing efforts in other organizations, including in the United Nations and its agencies? How can we better link different issues? So for example, if you look at circular economy and climate change, then we see that if we would move to a fully circular economy, we would cut our emissions of greenhouse gases by half. And then also, how can we combine social and environmental concerns? For example, when we talk about the just transition to a low carbon economy, where environmental sustainability needs to be just and supported and also legitimate in order to make the shift towards a low carbon economy feasible. And finally, on the purpose of this session. This is not a one-off event, but rather a starting point as we plan to take your ideas at this event to an event that we plan to host along MC12. And your ideas could also be useful for an NGO statement that we will publish ahead of MC12. And with that, I would like to give the floor to you, Yvonne. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joachim, for the very kind introduction. The question you put on my table to answer here as a sort of kickoff of the session was how the WTO and trade policy could be more humanized. So I think I will start with a very positive remark that first, human beings are dealing at the WTO and no robots. So there's certainly one step which is already done. On a more serious and second note, one should take into account the preamble of the WTO, which speaks also of raising standard of living, of full employment, and of course also of sustainable development and the environment. So this is really embedded in the pure existence of the WTO. So what I would like to focus on a little bit in my intervention is one way of having a solution. So obviously it's a very complex problematic how to integrate human rights social policy in the WTO. And there are certainly several solutions out there, but one I would specifically highlight, and these are human rights impact assessment. So we've done in collaboration with OHCHR and UNECA a few years ago an ex-ante human rights impact assessment of the African continental free trade area. And I think this is a very good way and example that it fits together. So trade policy and human rights are not contradictory per se, but you can harmonize them and use them as a very important and powerful tool. So if we speak about human rights impact assessment and trade agreements, you could think about an ex ante, meaning having it prior to the signing of the agreement, which has the big advantage that prior of really deciding or making the decision how the agreement should look like, governmental decision makers are taking into account the needs of various groups in the society, whether they have positive or may have positive or negative impacts of such a trade agreement. And in case one expects to have a negative impact on a certain part of the society, one could think about prior to signing the agreement, what are the measures to reduce the negative impacts of those. And of course, if you run a human rights impact assessment from a more structural perspective, and you really want to embed it in the trade policy, you should also keep in mind having an ex post one. So once the agreement is signed, is in force and is implemented, policymakers should keep track how the impacts are on various groups of the societies, and also looking at those who are always, or not always, but often neglected. So in one, to give you a more practical example, one of the case studies you find in this publication are the informal cross-border traders. So this is certainly a group when it comes to Africa, which are of crucial importance in trade policy, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We are speaking here in most cases, or many cases, of women. In other parts of Africa. So also many men are involved in or are informal cross-border traders, but they have been neglected for a long time by government officials. And this is a very first step to say, as a trade policy negotiator, there is a group out there who is affected by trade policy, and whatever decision we may take, this will impact their daily life. And the second attempt is then to see what are their rights and how can we, from a trade policy perspective, ensure that these rights are fulfilled. Since Joachim said that this session is not going to be a classical panel session, but that we would like to have really an interaction with all of you. A few are sitting in the room, the others of you are joining virtually. I think I stop here and we'll take it from there.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for that bigger picture perspective. Next, I would like to ask Mary-Lisa Madel, our second panelist, to intervene. Mary-Lisa is the Senior Trade Policy Advisor at the UK mission here in Geneva. And we would like to ask you to give a country perspective on humanizing the WTO. Thank you, Mary-Lisa.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion, which I'm sure we'll have. It's always a bit risky to ask the United Kingdom to provide a perspective on the global trading system, unless you really want to go back to Adam Smith and the Corn Laws. But I'll avoid that and not start at the beginning. So not at the beginning of the GATT, maybe just before the beginning of this year, which is when the United Kingdom began operating as a WTO member in its own right for the first time in 40 years. So the first observation that I would make is that we need to think about what the WTO means for everyone. when the UK was establishing its independent trade policy, essentially from scratch, we consulted widely as part of that process. And of course, that means hearing from trade experts, which is very important. But we also reached out to all of our domestic stakeholders, first to educate them about what trade and the WTO meant, but then also to learn what their priorities were. And my observation is that it's fairly easy to hear from businesses, people who are active in trade, about what they want from the WTO and the global trading system. But it's much harder to get input from other stakeholders who may not be familiar with the trading system and not know that their priorities, whether it's the environment, labor, economic development at home or in partner countries, may also be affected by international trade. My second observation relates to how the WTO makes decisions. So those familiar with the WTO are aware that the negotiating function is somewhat blocked at the moment. And this is a problem if you want to reshape the organization, because you need to get consensus among all the members to change its direction or modify the agreements to adapt the disciplines and the rules. And there are different solutions that have been discussed. One might be adopting new decision-making procedures. For example, creating a small but representative steering board that handles negotiations rather than trying to get agreement among all 164 members. And then there are also the possibility of plurilaterals, where a number of members decide to pursue a priority issue. And we see that in the e-commerce and domestic services regulation, investment facilitation, joint statement initiatives. So they are trying to develop new rules for trade that is potentially perhaps a limited. There's an obvious drawback because it's just a subset of the membership. And for the most part, those represent developed countries and developing countries are underrepresented. That brings me to my third observation, which is something of a personal opinion. And that is that one of the underlying factors behind the difficulty of achieving consensus at the moment is an erosion in the faith of the benefits of trade. And it's related to both of my other observations. So the economic principle that an open, predictable, rules-based international trading system contributes to growth and harmony is the underlying foundation of the WTO. However, the operating system of the WTO is mercantilism, where I'll give you access to my market if you give me access to yours. So there's a conflict there. And if too many of the members are focused just on this mercantilist aspect, it's very difficult to move beyond that. And then there's a corollary with that. It's difficult to convince even trade people of this benefit of trade and of the WTO. So it's going to be even harder to convince people outside the system. So perhaps people working in the areas of environment where I do a lot of work, or in human rights, that trade can be good. But where we need to have a conversation where that fundamental belief is more accepted by everyone, because you can't have a discussion about how to reform the international trade system if you just want to dismantle it. And perhaps if we focus on where we have failed in setting up the trade system, perhaps by not taking account of some of the externalities in terms of environmental degradation or contributing to wage depression. If we focus on those externalities, maybe we can find ways to fix the system and make it work the way it's supposed to. Those are just a few of the observations that I've had about this debate, and hopefully they'll be somewhat helpful to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary-Lisa. And then before we hear from our third panelist, I would like to ask all the audience, and actually you're all participants because this is supposed to be a workshop. I would like to ask you all to think about questions, remarks, ideas that you have on how we can humanize the WTO. And then what I will do after Rajesh speaks is that I will take groups of ideas and questions. I will read them up and share them with everyone. And then I will see who from the panelists feels called to give further background on those ideas and questions and some reflections on those ideas. So with that, Rajesh, and I understand you will give your personal views here. You're not speaking on behalf of the International Trade Center. And with that, I would like to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also that, please bear with me, I'll be deliberately provocative because this is a debating environment in any case. See, last night I tried looking into the Cambridge English Dictionary about what is the meaning of humanizing. And I found that humanize is the process of making something less unpleasant. It's a double negative, something less unpleasant and more suitable for the people. So it is in this context I'm approaching this subject in Humanizing WTO from the perspective of small businesses, subsistence farmers, traditional artisans, etc., in the developing and of course the least developed countries who have borne the brunt of trade liberalization. Now, these people represent an overwhelming proportion, majority of people in developing world. Their numbers will be in billions in absolute terms. Now, to my mind, the debate about humanizing WTO is not about whether trade is good or bad for poverty reduction and economic prosperity of the people. We know that, the answers to these questions. This debate is about reducing unpleasantness. And that's why I was quoting the definition as in the Cambridge Dictionary. It is about reducing unpleasantness of trade liberalization for those who lost out and not about celebrating the achievement of winners of this paradigm. So I hope that I've been able to make that subtle distinction clear for the sake of debate. Now, these people who are adversely affected by trade liberalization have generally branded WTO as devilish. I don't think one needs to conduct a formal perception-based survey to prove this point. Therefore, any notion of humanizing WTO, hopefully to reduce the devilish perception of WTO amongst this class of stakeholders, should be welcomed. Now, what do these people in developing countries, why do these people harbor this kind of perception? Because they see small businesses, subsistence farmers, traditional artisans being pushed out of their jobs, vocations by big businesses using high-tech instruments of mass production, and push these peoples out of the market. Now, the problem is further compounded by the fact that their governments, with inadequate financial resources at their command, are not able to support the structural adjustment required to reskill the displaced workers for alternative jobs to be able to get benefits of the liberalized economic environment, trading environment. Now, it didn't come out that much in the panel today, but what do we generally hear about the ideas on humanizing WTO? One is that it should become a forum for linking trade with labor rights, for example. Now, I'm sure that the ex-ante human rights assessments of any free trade agreement, etc., which is done, looks at these kind of compliance with the labor regulations, and those kind of things are looked into. I mean, there is no doubt civilized world should promote basic rules, labor standards such as elimination of forced or compulsory labor, effective abolition of child labor, elimination of discrimination in respect of employment, etc. Now, these fundamental ILO conventions have been adapted by many developing countries and are applied to ensure human rights at workplaces. We hear a lot these days about environmental degradation, climate change, how trade can help mitigate the adverse impact on environment. Again, an extremely laudable cause about which there can be no two opinions. Now the question arises, what can WTO do to implement such noble intentions? Now, the approach to humanizing WTO, if taken to mean new regulatory compliance requirements, new standards of which, achievement of which is outside the competence of technology deficit countries in the developing world, it will only increase the cost of doing business in developing countries, making them even more uncompetitive, vis-a-vis technologically advanced big companies from, say, developed countries, or even more advanced developing countries. Now, for this class of stakeholders, small businesses, farmers, artisans, I mean, that's what I'm restricting so that, I am not subjected to many questions, so I'm restricting myself to this constituency of people. Can this be termed humanizing or dehumanizing? Now, all these remedies, which are couched in laudatory intentions and visionary statements, apparently reflect the desire to protect blue-collar workers in developed countries at the cost of workers in developing countries, essentially to ward off criticism that we see these days in the political circles in those countries, that trade liberalization will lead to shift in jobs to developing countries due to lower wages and lax labor standards in these countries. Now, if there is real intention of humanizing WTO for the kind of stakeholders that I'm referring to, I think WTO at some point in time in history had focus and perhaps continues to do so. It should be on reducing, say, massive subsidization of agriculture in rich countries, which is giving unfair competition to smallholder farmers in other parts of the world, recognizing traditional knowledge of indigenous communities and preventing it from being usurped by unfair, patent practices, helping countries perhaps to transit to environment-friendly production processes and practices through appropriate technology transfer modalities, and financial assistance for structural adjustment programs, just to name a few. Now, these are some of the issues which should be revived in WTO if we are serious about humanizing WTO. Now, these issues were being debated, as I said, when I used to be a delegate, there were many working groups working on some of these issues. They have been overshadowed by the so-called 21st century issues which by their own nature tend to favor the prime movers of new technology, which undoubtedly rests with the industrialized world. Now, any attempt at unilaterally linking trade policies and international trade agreements with human rights, labor rights, sustainability standards, this is what, I found that now, and ex ante, human right evaluations of the FTAs, which, for example, EU wants to take up with other countries. Now, these practices, and a vigorous push to inscribe these practices in the multilateral agenda without addressing the root causes of seemingly lax standards in developing countries, I think is creating doubts in the mind of stakeholders as to the real intention behind the so-called humanizing agenda of the WTO. Now, if this trend continues, and I hope that I'm wrong in my perceptions, if these perceptions are not set right, I think a view will gain ground that we are not humanizing, but rather reinforcing the devilish perception of the WTO amongst these poor people in the developing and the least developed countries. I stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajesh, for this perspective that we often don't hear in the WTO, especially if we're caught up in our own perspectives from wherever other parts of the world we come from. So with that, I see that we have no questions yet, or remarks yet. At least I don't see any on the platform here. Maybe I could then first ask a question to the panelists, and that is really about a very human aspect of our lives, which is stories, narratives. People live by stories and narratives. And when I talk to people who are not working with trade or the WTO, what I often hear is the question, so what is the narrative of the WTO? Of course, after the Cold War, the narrative was clear. The world would be one. The Cold War was over. Globalization was very popular. But currently, I feel the WTO is looking for a new narrative. So what could be some elements of that narrative, you think? Maybe I can start with you, Yvonne.
That's a tough one. Yeah, how to start? I mean, from my perspective, and delineating a bit further what I've presented earlier, it's really that we need to be successful in really having this marriage between trade policy and other policies. So at the moment, we are really in competition with each other, whether it's on the domestic level, whether the Ministry of Finance is a big player, the Ministry of Economy, and all the others are all the others somewhere else. Huh? So there is a clear hierarchy, which from from the perspective of an individual, it doesn't make any sense, because during my life cycle, it might be very important for me that a social policy is gets the highest priority and less some economic or pure economic parts. And we see the same here in Geneva. So we do work in silos. Here is the WTO just a kilometer away, takes place or is meeting the Human Rights Council. A bit further up the hill, we have the ILO and the WHO, and you hardly see a connection on the day-to-day basis. So I don't want to blame anyone personally, you know? So everyone is stuck with the mandate they have, but there seems to be a very weak institutionalized connection between them. Yes, we hear that sometimes it should be promoted on a technical level, but you still meet a lot of people who might focus either on similar issues or sometimes even on the same issues, and they hardly speak to each other. So I think this is certainly an attempt which I would like to see changed in the future, and also for the WTO. So we do have a very small equipe in the OHCHR covering trade issues. They are embedded there with the right to development sections. I don't know anyone at the WTO who is looking into human rights obligations states have signed. So this is not a soft law thing. So those are obligations, but there is this very narrow approach to trade also reflected in the setup of the organization.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. This institutional integration, institutional coherence, and more holistic approaches. This is what we often hear about. And in that respect, the next 2-3 months will be very interesting when we have the COP26 coming up, the climate conference in Glasgow. And 1 month after that, we have the ministerial conference of the WTO. And one of the big questions, both at the WTO and often also in the climate negotiations, is how do we deal with the nexus between trade and climate change? And there also a lot more engagement we see is necessary between the communities. So the communities that work on trade, the communities that work on climate change, how to bring those communities together in a very constructive way. Because there's so much that could be done through trade and trade policy on climate change. Of course, the WTO would not be the only place to make climate policies, but at least the WTO could play a much more constructive role in ensuring that we deliver on the climate pledges. With that, Marlisa, which narrative would you like to see, or which narrative would you envision?
Well, one thing that we often forget is that the WTO is not an entity that operates on its own. So it is the members. And if the WTO doesn't achieve something, it's because the members were unable to make it happen. So I wouldn't say that we need to integrate the WTO with other institutions so much as we need to integrate our perhaps the governments of the members. So do the people who work on human rights talk to the people who work on trade and the people who work on health, and then have a little bit of a common language, develop a bit of a common language, and an appreciation that the different work streams are all important and can be mutually supportive. And if you have that kind of discussion going on in the governments of all the members, then perhaps you can overcome some of this siloing that we do see here in Geneva. So in the WTO Secretariat interacts with the ILO, they interact with the WHO, with ITC, of course, other entities. And so they share information and perspectives, but it's not their job to reach agreements. It's our job as members. And if there's a failing on the part of members, perhaps it's that we're not integrated enough. And perhaps that's a failing of trade negotiators who work off in their own corner which is a very zero-sum game corner, and not interacting with other parts of their government who might demonize trade a little bit. So how you can have that integration at the level of the members, which I think would help elevate the conversation at the levels of the organizations.
So indeed, the WTO as a community of members and also being part of this bigger universe, of course, of global governance, which I realized when while I was working recently on a paper on fossil fuel subsidy reform, where I went into writing the paper with the idea of what can the WTO do about fossil fuel subsidies. And luckily, my co-author, he reminded me that there's already a lot of other international organizations out there doing a lot of work on fossil fuel subsidy reform, including the IMF, the World Bank, OECD. So the question is more, how can the WTO complement that work? And in that sense, sometimes also some modesty, of course, is involved on behalf of the organization to see how it can fit in and complement work that is already ongoing. Then Rajesh, you said that humanizing means making something less unpleasant. And you also mentioned those people who are, let's say, losing out from trade, or at least not winning by it.